Good evening. Welcome to the Central Pennsylvania World War II Roundtable. My name is Bill Bridenstine. I'm one of the newer board members, and they also duly nominated and elected me to be treasurer as well. So thank you. And I also want to do a shout out to Bob Watkins. I know he's here. I saw him earlier. Where is he, Bob? There he goes. So Bob served as treasurer for many years, at least a decade, I'm sure, if not longer, and did such an excellent job. I want to thank him for all of his help with the transition to my duties as treasurer of the Roundtable. So, first order of business, we say the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of the meeting, so if you can all rise, and flags here. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So, a couple announcements and matters of business. So I have to give the cell phone message, so please mute your cell phones or turn them off, just so we don't have any interruptions during the presentation. I'd also like to acknowledge and recognize all World War II veterans who are with us tonight. So if you could raise your hand or stand, we'd like to give you a round of applause for coming here tonight. Thank you for your service, and you're why we're here, so thank you very much. I'd also like to recognize all active duty or veterans of the armed forces as well. So anyone who has served in the armed services, please raise your hand or stand if you care to. Excellent. Thank you so much. Am I speaking too loud? I hope, I'm not used to the mic. It's just, if it's a problem, let me know. Okay, thank you. Also, a couple other announcements. As many of you know, this coming weekend is a big event in Reading. It's a World War II weekend. I'm sure most of you have been there or thinking about going. I'd highly recommend it. I go most every year, set up in the hangar with a publishing business, Monroe Publications. And actually, my business partner is back there, Jay Wirtz, so give a shout out to him. So we'll be in the hangar. If you're at the event this weekend, please stop by and say hi to us. Also, as you leave the event this evening, we have a few gentlemen, we call them the Helmet Committee. So they're grateful to take any donations you care to offer, to benefit the organization. Also, you may have seen as well, there's a bargain book table, I'll call it, for the round table. So we take donations of books from anyone who cares to, and then it gives you an opportunity to pick up some nice titles for $2 or $3. It's a good find. And also, I want to mention for any of you who saw the young gentleman from Midtown Scholar Bookshop. He is carrying Dr. McManus's latest, To the End of the Earth, the U.S. Army and the Downfall of Japan, 1945. This is the final installment in Dr. McManus's trilogy on the War in the Pacific, which we'll be covering this evening. So, I think I've done about enough talking, but I want to give a brief introduction to Dr. McManus. I'm sure many of you have heard him talk before. He's no stranger to the Roundtable here in Hummelstown. We're very glad to have him back. He just happened to be in Carlisle today and maybe the next few days. So I'm sure it's a multi-day trip for his research. Like I mentioned, his new book is out. It's been out about a month now. He is the Curator's Distinguished Professor of U.S. Military History at the Missouri University of Science and Technology. He's the recipient of the prestigious Gilder-Lehrman Prize for Military History, and he's the author of 14 previous works. He is published by by Dutton Caliber, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And I also just wanted to give just a quick overview. I'm sure he'll be covering a lot of this during the talk, but I liked his publicity department put together a very nice synopsis, which I would just want to hit these highlights before he has the opportunity to delve into them a bit further. As described here, To the End of the Earth, dealing primarily with the last year of the war in the Pacific, details the accounts of 1945's most pivotal moments. It's a fascinating look at Americans in the China theater, the shocking emergence of kamikazes, in-depth analysis of the strategic setbacks throughout 1945, and it also has a nuanced exploration of the Japanese military leaders. So without further ado, I'd like to have Dr. McManus come and talk to us about his latest work. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Bill. I'd like to thank the Roundtable for having me back. You've heard me speak and you actually want me back, so I really appreciate that. I'd like to thank some old friends, Charlie Lloyd and Chris Huffman, who I've known now for several years, and they've still put up with me this long. Thank all World War II veterans, of course, especially the legendary Chuck Klein, my buddy there, who we've known for years. So, and all of you for making time in your schedule to come out tonight on a beautiful evening. So, I'd like to just sort of take you through the world of the U.S. Army in 1945. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. No. All right. Cliff's on it. That's much better. There we go. So where are we as 1945 dawns in the Pacific Asia theater? Well, at this point, the U.S. Army has really come to a point of more or less full maturity. It is in all over this map as you're looking here. It exists in Alaskan outposts, in viney, choking jungles in Burma, in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the caves of Biak, Leyte in the Philippines, just a dizzying array of small islands and portions of the Asian continent, everything in between. The Army had really, by this point, done the vast majority of the fighting in the war against Japan. As 1945 dawned, 1.4 million ground soldiers were spread across nearly a third of the world's surface of ocean and continent and island. And it was a dispersion of geography and command really unprecedented before or since in American history. By now, this Army had matured into what I would argue is possibly the most potent, sophisticated land force in human history to that point in time. And yet major battles loomed ahead. And the question by 1945 isn't necessarily whether the Allies are going to win the war, but just how long it's going to take and how terrible and how destructive and bloody it's going to be from this point forward. Now, by the time the war was over, some 1.8 million American U.S. Army ground soldiers served in the war against Japan, the Pacific or Asia. To give you a little perspective, that's the third largest military force this country has ever sent overseas to fight a war, behind only the European theater armies in World Wars I and II. And it is certainly, by 1945, and certainly by the end of the war, the most amphibious, experienced, and capable ground force in human history to that point in time. The Army comprised in the Pacific about 21 infantry and airborne divisions, plus several other regimental combat teams, engineer special brigades, tank battalions and groups, armored groups and the like, that probably comprise another 3 to 4 to 5 divisions worth of combat soldiers. And by the way, those numbers I'm giving you do not include the Army Air Forces. Of course, the Air Force is part of the Army in World War II. So it doesn't even include that. This is just the ground component. So the size of the Army dwarfs the size of the U.S. Marine Corps at that point. And yet I do think, and one of the things that led me to writing this trilogy, there's a sense, I think, in our popular memory of World War II, even among those who know the war quite well, that the Army kind of focused on Europe, where obviously there was a major war to be won and a major job, and obviously the Army deploys millions of soldiers to Europe and the Mediterranean, and that the Marine Corps did the fighting on the ground in the Pacific. and that this is just simply not true. The Marine Corps mobilized at full strength 6 divisions. That's the largest the Corps has ever been in its history. And 6 divisions then participate in the war against Japan. And as you know, the Army mobilized almost 4 times that many to fight against Japan. In terms of amphibious invasions, the Marine Corps carried out 15 in the course of the whole war. Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger's 8th Army alone carried out 35 in the Philippines in the spring and summer 1945. So by pointing this out, and I know I've mentioned this before when I've been here, but it bears repeating. By pointing this out, I'm not looking to denigrate the Marine Corps, actually quite the opposite. That when you get a sense of how few Marines there were, you get a sense of how the Marine Corps was really punching above its weight, how it played certainly a crucial role in the war, but it just simply wasn't big enough to fight the whole war on its own, and it didn't have the multiple skill sets that the Army was equipped to do. The Marine Corps tended to be combat heavy, focusing most of its manpower on especially light infantry and armored forces. The Army is dealing with many, many other jobs besides just sort of the combat orientation. So the Marines, of course, punching way above their weight, the valor off the charts, but they are a partner of the Army and kind of a much smaller piece of the ground war in the Pacific than I think is popularly recalled. So nearly 42,000 of these soldiers, guys like this, would not survive this war. Felled by, as they were, by combat, by disease, accidents, the terrible privation of captivity. Most of the U.S. POWs in the war against Japan were Army. It was a harvest of death that totaled, get this, more than the entirety of any previous American conflict, with obviously the notable exception of the Civil War in World War I. So that alone, 42,000 soldiers dying in the war against Japan, is a larger number, again, to repeat, than in any single American war previous to this, except World War I and the Civil War. Gives you a little perspective. The Army by 1945 is just staggeringly complex, with vast capabilities seldom seen in the course of human events. And it's proven itself to have just a kind of a breathtaking variety of missions that it's embarked on. Just to give you a few examples, grand strategical planning. Army leaders were doing that. They're the main grand strategists in this war on many levels. Working with allies, inter-service coordination, which of course the Army isn't going anywhere without the Navy, of course. And the Navy rightfully feels that the Pacific Theater, that they own the Pacific Theater on some levels, because shipping is the key to everything. And controlling sea lanes and controlling the water, and ultimately, of course, controlling enough land to build airfields and project air power. Of course, air power was becoming increasingly important too. So, of course, inter-service coordination had become seriously crucial. Diplomacy along those lines, diplomacy in joint operations with allies, especially the Australians, especially New Zealanders, especially, and I think this is perhaps most meaningful and the most tragic, coordination with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese army, which ultimately kind of goes sideways, and I think with terrible consequences long term for what happens in China. The Army is intimately involved in that. Logistics, which of course is the foundation of all this, and you're not going to win anything without supply, and the Army is really carrying out most of the supply operations, and believe you me, this is massive. Transportation, and I'm alluding, of course, not just to ground transportation of trucking and whatever else, but also water transportation. The Navy is so stretched thin that the Army runs its own mini Navy during World War II. The U.S. Army transport ships. So you have that going on. Engineering. I mean, this is an engineer's war to some extent too, especially the building of airfields. Aviation engineers are so crucial to this war. The more famous side of that is the Navy construction battalions, or Seabees, who of course are a key component and a key contributor to victory. The Army, though, is doing it on a scale probably 3 or 4 times of what the Navy is, of building airfields, improving airfields, doing whatever needs to be done to project air power. That's a huge part of this war, and of course all the other kinds of combat engineering that you would expect. The building of structures, warehouses, recovering, and road recovery, road building. I mean, on and on and on it goes. The gathering of intel. I mean, this is a huge part of what the Army is doing as well. Guerrilla operations, especially in the Philippines, but also in portions of Burma, the South Pacific, wherever else. Medical care on a scale unimaginable even a generation earlier. Civil affairs, working with locals, especially, of course, once you are invading the Philippines, coming back to the Philippines, working with locals, especially with Filipino guerrillas, who are major players in 1945 in operations in the archipelago. Mortuary affairs, caring for bodies and figuring out how the burials, all of this kind of stuff. Ground combat operations, of course, of nearly every type, fought in some of the world's most inhospitable locales against a foe who recognized few Western-style rules of warfare. That's a big part, obviously, what the Army is doing, too. So you're plunged into this kind of elemental death struggle that I would argue that few Americans grasped at the time and perhaps even ever since. So many of these soldiers had sort of a glimpse some of the troubling future that lay ahead, the irregular warfare, the moral ambiguities now of combat against foes who didn't recognize clear rules of warfare or Geneva Convention or whatever it would be. That forces you to kind of confront your own moral center and figure out where you draw the line and what kind of scruples you have and what you have to do to survive. The rapid modernization of weapons, the deadlier weapons, racial strife that was certainly bubbling under the surface, especially on the Asian continent. Post-colonial uncertainty, flawed alliances, the American struggle for influence in Asia and the Pacific, a crucial enterprise that I think we might all agree the United States has never yet mastered nor relinquished in the decades since. The Army had kind of glimpsed all this. Another thing to kind of bear in mind, with the exception of Grenada, Panama, Mogadishu, pretty much every American war since World War II has been fought somewhere on the Asian landmass, and almost all of the dying has happened in ground fighting. At the very time when ground fighting was supposed to go away, when nuclear weapons were supposed to make the infantrymen obsolete, here are the facts. Ground fighting has accounted for 90% of American war deaths since World War II. Most by Army soldiers, but with a serious assist from the Marine Corps as well. So that gives you maybe a little bit of perspective here, too, of what the armies were in the Pacific sort of portends for the post-war period, too. And that's why I say it's not just a matter of mere passing kind of service pride or whatever to understand that the Army does the vast majority of the fighting and the plurality of the dying in the war against Japan. It is important to understand that because if you look at the possibility of any future war in that part of the globe, if you think that it was just sort of Marine Corps expeditionary warfare with the Navy controlling most of the war, then you have a serious misapprehension for what could lay ahead in any future conflict too. So these things do matter. And I don't propose you walk you through all of the Army battles in 1945. For that, obviously, you have to read the book. You have to buy it and read it, and I do recommend that. You have to do that inside and out and thoroughly and buy as many copies as possible. But I will give you some highlights. So here's, of course, the guy we have to begin talking about when we're talking about the Army in the Pacific Theater, Douglas MacArthur. You see him here as a 5-star general, which he was by the end of 1944. And he is on the cusp of beginning operations to liberate one of the most beloved places on the planet for him, Luzon, the largest and often called main island in the Philippines. Now, you probably know his forces had invaded in the Philippines a couple months earlier at Leyte, where fighting was still ongoing. But January 1945, of course, is when his forces are on the cusp of invading at Luzon. MacArthur loved the Philippines, had served a lot of his military career there, had made it his home on the eve of the war, of course. And what distinguishes MacArthur from any other U.S. military officer in World War II is that he had once been the head of his service. He was Army Chief of Staff in the 1930s, and then during the war, he's a theater commander. So he has seniority over pretty much everybody. And boy, doesn't he know it, and doesn't he want to, sort of have those sharp elbows and move them around. MacArthur has very, very distinct ideas about what he thinks operations should be in 1945. And most of what he wants centers around the liberation of the Philippines. In a way, he almost prioritizes this over the invasion of Japan itself and the defeat of Japan in a way, but he would tell you, I think, controlling the Philippines means defeating Japan. And that's partially what he will argue. He'll also argue with a kind of evangelical intensity that America's future lay in Asia and in the Pacific. He was an ardent opponent of the Germany first or Europe first policy. And he will never shrink from that sort of argument throughout the rest of his life. And I do think, in retrospect, he has some merit to his argument. though he certainly doesn't seem to grasp the threat Nazi Germany posed to the security, certainly of Europe, but also Atlantic sea lanes and so on and so forth. So who is this guy? What's he like? Well, he's complex to the point of convolution. And a close aide once said of him, none of us really knew MacArthur. We all saw fragments of the man. There was a lot of truth to that. He was remarkably courageous, but also epically conniving, and epically self-serving at times. His pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dusty Rhodes, who knew him probably as well as anybody because he spent so much time with him, he said he had some feeling that he was a man of destiny. He seemed to believe that he was especially protected so that he could fulfill a mission. And of course, that mission was the liberation of the Philippines. That's what is really animating MacArthur by this point in time. So he has under his command two key instruments to carry out that crusade, as he certainly would have seen it, were his army commanders, both of whom were highly experienced combat leaders by 1945, and who had developed an intense rivalry that MacArthur will exploit for the furtherance of his mission. So the first guy is this guy you see here on the left, Lieutenant General Walter Kruger. He's standing next to, by the way, Vice Admiral Tommy Kincaid on the right. Admiral Kincaid really had become a close partner with MacArthur and what MacArthur's theater was called Southwest Pacific Area, or SWAPA. Kincaid had really become one of the leading practitioners of amphibious warfare and had worked closely with MacArthur and his commanders, such as Kruger. General Kruger, I think, just has a fascinating background. He was actually not born in this country. He was born in Germany. In 1881, he was a son of a German army officer who died when Kruger was, I think, an adolescent. And so Kruger's mother picked up stakes and moved with him to the United States. So he emigrates to the United States. What's kind of interesting to me is that initially they settled in St. Louis, which is where I'm from and where I live. And the reason they did that is Kruger's uncle ostensibly owned a brewery there, and that was very common in the late 19th century in St. Louis, German-American breweries. It was a big part of the St. Louis economy. So they make a home for themselves there initially before moving around. But in 1898, Kruger, of course, is 17, and the Spanish-American War breaks out. And he wants to be part of it. So he joins the Army as a 17-year-old private. And about a half century later, he retires as a 4-star general. I mean, that had never happened before, and I dare say it'll never happen again. So not only did Walter Kruger, unlike so many of his officer peers who were, sort of on the high command track, not only did he have no West Point pedigree, he had no college degree, he had no high school diploma. He was the ultimate kind of self-educated guy, an autodidact. He spoke multiple languages fluently, obviously German, Spanish, French, and he was very proud of the fact that he spoke English with hardly any trace of an accent. And so he starts out as a private, he goes through the NCO ranks, and then he gets commissioned, from the ranks. And where is he commissioned? When he's serving in the Philippines in the early 20th century. So he has these ties to the Philippines too. So in spite of the fact that he didn't have the advantages of all that education, he had become, by the 1920s, a kind of a first-class military intellectual wonk. He wrote these scholarly articles on military strategy and topics and whatnot. And so Kruger was actually very erudite, but also a relentlessly pragmatic soldier whose greatest strength as a commander was that he had a great rapport and affinity for the average soldier, especially the average infantryman, because he'd been one. If he had a weakness, it was the fact that he was brusque, he could be rude, he could be short, he was impatient, and he didn't always schmooze. He wasn't a schmoozing kind of guy, but he had a sort of inner strength. This is a comment about him from someone who worked for him, and I'll identify this person in a moment. I think you'll probably know him. Few generals are physically tougher or more active. Relentlessly driving himself, he had little need of driving others. They were quick to follow his example. That was Dwight Eisenhower, who worked for Kruger as his chief of staff when Kruger was commander of 3rd Army right before World War II. One of his other commanders who served under him in the Pacific once assessed, he was a good soldier and a good strategist and very sound thinker, but he didn't have much of a personality. That was exactly it. He wasn't always a nice person to deal with, but he was also very true, he was very honest, He's very human. He was a great husband to his wife Grace, and a warm father to his 3 children. So at Luzon, he commanded 6th Army, which was the largest ground element in the Pacific Theater for the U.S. Armed Forces. And he will actually command more ground troops in the Pacific Theater than any other single American general. So the other Army commander is this guy, Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, who's so similar and yet so different. Eichelberger was the son of a Civil War veteran on the Union side who came from Ohio. Eichelberger's father was a very successful lawyer and also a gentleman farmer who owned quite a bit of land. Eichelberger was the youngest of 5 children and grew up amid great economic comfort, but difficult relations with his father and sometimes with his siblings, because his father, like many parents, especially many veteran parents of something like the Civil War, grew up convinced, oh, my kids are soft. They don't know how tough the world is, and they're not ready for it, so I got to test them. I got to make sure to test them and make sure they're up to the struggle. So he's constantly having, the Eichelberger family was almost like this sort of reality show, in which the kids are constantly pitted against one another in competition. Well, think about it. If you're the youngest of 5, you're at quite a disadvantage, aren't you? You're constantly going to lose out to your bigger, stronger older brothers. He has 3 older brothers, 1 older sister. And he's at the short end of the stick. So Bobby wasn't taken very seriously, especially by his father, and this creates in him this kind of yearning to succeed and distinguish himself. And of course, the place to do that for him becomes the U.S. Army. He went to West Point, graduated in the class of 1909 as an infantryman, and is sort of relentlessly driven and quite ambitious, but also has this moral center to him. One of his classmates was a guy named George Patton. I'm sure you've heard of him. And they become friends, and they were friends for the rest of their lives. I found a lot of letters that they wrote to each other during the war. And I mention this not just because it's interesting on a personal level, but I think they were very similar in terms of their operational outlook and how they thought about leading soldiers and combat operations. So Eichelberger, really the center of his life is his wife Emma, who he met when he was serving in the Panama Canal as a young officer. And he and Emma had a very strong bond as soulmates. And happily enough, for an historian, during World War II, he wrote to Emma constantly, sometimes 2-3 times a day, even in combat. So it's this incredible record of what he's doing and thinking. And you can kind of see the bond there. They had no kids, they had each other, and they had Bob's career. And during World War I, most of his peers were going, of course, to France to serve in the war against the Germans. Well, he goes to the Polar Bear expedition, which was the abortive Western Allied and Japanese effort to eliminate the nascent communist regime during the Russian Civil War. So he saw combat, he was an intel officer, and quite meaningfully, too, he serves embedded for a time with a Japanese army regiment, and he studies them. Eichelberger was also, like Kruger, very, very intellectual, very erudite. He enjoyed many more advantages than Kruger in terms of his background and his education, but they were quite similar in that dedication and that kind of military intellectualism. And Eichelberger, though, one thing is very different. He's much more aggressive, much more a lead from the front kind of guy than is Kruger. And the term you often hear, Kruger is cautious. And there's some truth to that, in a good way and sometimes, though, in a bad way. As one of Eichelberger's friends once said of him, I think this really encapsulates the man. He's one of the most colorful and attractive individuals it's been my good fortune to meet. General Eichelberger had a rare way with people. He enjoyed people, all kinds of people. And because of his lively curiosity, vitality, and basic optimism, he never became an old man. And above all, he was honest. And that's exactly it. Eichelberger was someone who had no enemies, in a sense. He was a very pleasant person, but also kind of a driver, and who loved soldiers and loved leading them from the front. So during the Philippines campaign, MacArthur understands the tension and the rivalry between these two. Where has it come from? Eichelberger feels that Kruger's just been insufferably rude to him. And Eichelberger can't conceive of being rude to people, no matter the circumstance. He's someone who is very empathetic to others and their feelings. And he just felt that Kruger was tough to deal with. He didn't like how methodical he was, how cautious he was. He thought of him as a plotter, as a kind of second-rate kind of commander. Kruger thought Eichelberger was too indulgent with his staff, with weak people who he didn't deal with in a tough way or whatever. So here's this tension. Well, invasion happens, and a busy map, but I think a useful one nonetheless. January 9th, 1945. You see 4 U.S. Army divisions that are going to land there at Lingayen Gulf, which is where the Japanese had landed in 1941. That's, by the way, in terms of ground combat elements being sent ashore as amphibious invaders, that's larger than the American contribution to the Normandy invasion. Okay, just to give you a little perspective there too. And it's completely an Army show in terms of the ground combat there. Will the Marines be involved in the Philippines campaign? Yes, but mainly on the air side. There will be close air support units that are going to be really good and really form a good partnership with Army units, but there's not Marine ground units involved in the Philippines. So you wonder, do the Japanese have a fleet to try and stop this massive Allied fleet that is now at the gates of Luzon? Not really, because they'd really been devastated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf a few months earlier. So their main opposition, the main thing you have to worry about if you're a sailor, is kamikaze attacks, which have been in place since 1944. And so the Japanese have some land-based air kamikazes who are going to be coming from the Philippines and also Formosa, which is now Taiwan. And they're going to launch these series of attacks that do damage but don't stop these operations from going on. About 503 sailors are killed, though, I should point out. And 24 ships are damaged. And one of the people who's killed is Lieutenant General Herbert Lumsden, who was a British liaison officer attached to MacArthur's headquarters and was really, really well liked. It was a terrible tragedy. So as horrible as that is, the Japanese are in no position to stop the invasion. What do they hope to do once the Americans are ashore? Well, they've got an army of about 280,000 soldiers under one of their finest commanders, General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Yamashita's concept is not to try and oppose the Americans at the waterline where he knows he'll never be able to stop them, but to just sort of take shelter, as you see up there in the rough terrain of northern Luzon, in the mountains and the jungles and the caves, and just bleed them in this inland campaign. So he's got 3 main components, as you see, the Shimbu, Kembu, and Shobu groups, and that are split up, and Yamashita is with the northern group. Okay, so the problem is that MacArthur's intelligence officer, Major General Charles Willoughby, thinks there's only about 152,000 Japanese on Luzon. And he thinks this in part because it's what MacArthur wants to think. So that'll constantly sort of misinform his outlook at times. But that's the Japanese plan. So 6th Army, as you see, is in control of this invasion. And they get ashore just fine, but now it's a matter of unloading freight, moving supplies, developing the airfields, reconstructing the roads, all those unglamorous things that are really, really important. There's 11,000 short tons of supplies and ammo moving across the beaches each day. It's a major job to develop depots and rail lines. Filipino labor plays a key role in this, and Filipino guerrillas too play a huge role here and in the whole campaign as intel, as light infantry, harassing and ambushing the Japanese, all of that kind of stuff. So in the wake of this is a kind of a closer look. You can see up here, I Corps is going to kind of hold this northern shoulder. So what is a corps in World War II? It's multiple divisions. So ICON are under Major General Palmer Swift to hold that northern flank and make sure Yamashita's guys from here in the north don't come down and nail the invasion beaches, while 14th Corps under Major General Oscar Griswold makes the main move towards Manila, which obviously is a key objective. And also, I should point out, northwest of Manila, Clark Airfield, a series of airfields that obviously are crucial. So those are the 2 key sort of objectives of the Luzon campaign. Griswold had proven himself to be an excellent commander, and it always seemed like he got the toughest and dirtiest jobs, and he will here. So Kruger is really worried, though, as 14th Corps is advancing down here quite slowly, in the second half of January. He's really worried the Japanese are going to attack him on his flanks from this direction, maybe even from the west, too. But the other thing, too, you're dealing with serious transportation problems. There are 217 wooden bridges that are out over the water sources that you have to cross. So think about that, what that means from a transportation and engineering point of view. Infantry maybe can slosh across a lot of these streams or whatever, but not vehicles, and you need the vehicles. So the engineers are constantly having to reclaim this. But also, I will say, it's Kruger's sort of nature to be methodical, to worry about the flanks, to worry about what the opposition could be doing, to just move at his pace and not take too many risks. Well, this starts to really exasperate MacArthur, who is constantly trying to prod him to go and get Clark Field and get Manila. He really wants those objectives. And there's a bit of tension between them. In fact, so much so that at one point during this phase of the campaign, MacArthur will locate his headquarters ahead of Kruger's, ahead of 6th Army, as a way to kind of prod them and say, look, we're ahead of you, why don't you move faster? And he'll even, sort of hint, Walter, maybe you ought to move even faster, but it doesn't work. Now, one of the things I say in the book is, in truth, if MacArthur is frustrated and he doesn't like the situation, in a way he's only got himself to blame, because he's kind of miscast his commanders. If you want someone to lead one of that quick dash to Manila, to not worry about the flanks or what the Japanese are doing, to move heaven and earth, to get people moving very quickly, the person is Eichelberger, not Kruger. Kruger has a very good grasp of the tactical realities here, but he doesn't understand as well as MacArthur and really even Eichelberger the strategic purpose of this whole thing. You've got to go and get these objectives. Clark, obviously, because you need the airfields. Manila, obviously for its symbolic reasons, as the capital of the Philippines, but maybe even more meaningfully, because of its port. Because that's how you're going to supply yourself in this massive campaign to liberate the Philippines. You must have it. It's like what Antwerp is in Europe, or Marseille in Europe. Manila is that for the Philippines. So Eichelberger is really your guy if you want that quick dash, and yet he's given the job to Kruger. Well, realizing this, MacArthur decides, I'm going to bring Eichelberger into play here, and he decides to unleash him from the south, down here in a much smaller operation. So Eichelberger commands 8th Army, a peer army to 6th by this point, and he gives Eichelberger control of the 11th Airborne Division to launch this invasion. You see the invasion January 31st at this place called Nasugbu. Now that's south of Manila, and the idea is you're going to come up from the south and you'll be you'll be catching the Japanese in these pincer movements. So the 11th Airborne is a really good candidate for this in the sense of how it's paratroopers and it's glidermen. These are daredevils, and these are natural troublemakers, aren't they? That's what paratroopers are, and sort of glidermen too. These are people who are actually going to ride rickety canvas gliders into combat. Really? These are guys who are risk takers. They're elite soldiers on some levels, but there's only about 8,000 of them. So it's a snake charmer kind of thing. You're going in there outnumbered, and Eichelberger will basically be kind of a de facto division commander in tandem with the 11th Airborne's actual commander, Joe Swing, who is every bit as swashbuckling, every bit as aggressive. And they go in and they basically outfight, outthink, outwit, outflank the Japanese at every turn and go in the direction you see towards Manila. There's also, you see the little parachute here? There's an airborne landing there. The 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment lands at Tagaytay Ridge, and then they hook up with the main group coming along the roads, and then they turn north straight into Manila. And it's a flawed airborne landing, but it's effective. And the Japanese are just kind of stunned at every turn. And so there's hope at this point, especially from Eichelberger, who wants to upstage Kruger, of course, hope that they'll be able to get in and they'll be able to liberate Manila from the south. Well, that's too good to be true. The Japanese have set up a series of powerful layered defenses on the southern approaches to Manila, where they thought the main American effort would come from, called the Genko Line. And the 11th Airborne, as effective as it is, as good as it is, it can't overwhelm that on its own. From the north, there are two divisions, the 1st Cavalry Division and the 37th Infantry Division, that are moving in on Manila from that direction, as you see, as we get to the end of January and into February. And so what ends up happening, unfortunately, is just sort of protracted urban combat. Because the Japanese who are in Manila decide to stay there, or they're at least trapped there, some of them, and they decide they're going to basically hunker down and resist as best they can and sell their lives dear. Now this apparently is not what Yamashita wanted, that he never envisioned defending Manila. But I'll say this to you, and I just want you to think about this, because it's only my opinion. I was stunned to hear that, because Yamashita is an outstanding commander on a lot of levels. And his strategic purpose here, of course, is to bleed the Americans, isn't it? To kind of bog them down, deny them this key objective, and just bleed them. And then maybe that will alter the strategic balance and force the American government or the Allies to kind of have a negotiated settlement to the end of World War II that leaves them short of an occupation of Japan or whatever. Now, what better way to do that than to engage them in urban combat? Where, urban combat is bloody, it's difficult, it's protracted, it's ideal for the defenders, it's all of these kinds of things. And yet Yamashita doesn't seem to grasp the advantage of that terrain, and apparently hadn't seen what had gone on in the Battle of Stalingrad earlier in World War II and Battle of Aachen the previous fall, things like that. Be that as it may, why does it happen then? Well, of course, Yamashita is distant from this area. He doesn't really have communication with the Japanese forces in Manila. They're under an admiral, a rear admiral named Sanji Iwabuchi, who has a very different concept. And of course, you're probably aware the Japanese Army and the Navy don't get along very well in World War II. And so Iwabuchi decides, my main mission is to destroy all my naval assets here and the harbor facilities and all that. And then if I can get out, whatever, but otherwise I'll just fight to the end. And of course, that's what he does with a force of about 17,000 sailors. They're not Marines, by the way. There's no Japanese Marine Corps. You'll often hear that. They are either Japanese Naval Special Landing Forces or just guys who are dismounted from ships or admin people or whatever. They don't really have to be trained that much for urban warfare. They just have to have weapons, which many are taken from the ships or whatever, and then they just create fortifications in this urban environment. And there's some soldiers there too, a couple battalions worth, and now you have one of the worst urban battles in human history that rages throughout February 1945. Block by block, house by house, room by room. In order to gain any ground, you've got to support all of your movements with mortars, artillery, tanks, eventually airstrikes. Infantry assault squads carry Browning automatic rifles, bazookas, satchel charges, grenades, submachine guns, and most meaningfully, flamethrowers. Combat was intimate, bloody, horrifying. Sergeant Warren Matha said, by the way, here's a little closer look at he said, kick in the door, stick in the flamethrower nozzle, roast the Japanese alive. I can still hear them screaming. I could still smell the burning flesh. He was in the 5th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. The Americans sometimes even poured gasoline into Japanese-controlled buildings and roasted everyone inside. Even then, according to one intel officer, infantrymen had to, quote, actually enter dugouts, caverns, and pillboxes and annihilate them before resistance ceased. So this is what characterized the fighting in Manila. Horrifying, intimate, traumatic. Japanese bodies lay everywhere as the Americans advanced. You would see scenes like this, and I realize this isn't pleasant, but this is what happened. To guard against the ambushers playing dead, U.S. soldiers pumped bullets into the heads of nearly every corpse, then sprinkled them in vain with lime to try and dampen their stench. Maybe the worst aspect of the battle was the terrible destruction wrought on the people of Manila and the city landscape. This was a major city of 1.1 million people, 110 square miles. The worst of the fighting took place, of course, in the heart of downtown. But untold thousands of people were killed or wounded by the intense firepower. And this is, of course, very traumatic to the Americans. They don't want to destroy Manila. But that's the dilemma, isn't it? Because otherwise, you won't gain any ground, and everybody will be killed out there, block by block. You've got to have those supporting weapons in urban combat, and that's the dilemma of it, because you're going to destroy what you're liberating, ostensibly. It's very traumatic to MacArthur, too. This is his hometown, So in one climactic barrage, just an example, the Americans utilized 370,000 pounds of ordnance in one attack, to give you a sense of what that was like. So a lot of Filipinos are wounded or killed by this intense firepower of both sides, but more commonly, many fell prey to horrible, deliberate, savage Japanese atrocities. Iwabuchi, his HQ, issues orders to destroy everything. Docks, warehouses, factories, people. On the pretext that Filipinos are aiding the Americans, he and the other commanders sanctioned killing them all. All people on the battlefield, with the exception of Japanese military personnel, Japanese civilians, will be put to death, declared one chilling order. The order even included instructions on how to dispose of the bodies and advice on how to kill them without using up much ammo. So that led to a lot of stabbings and a lot of burnings. People being sort of packed into buildings, the buildings being burned, people being stabbed to death, raped and tortured. Absolutely horrible. Some of the perpetrators kept ghoulish tallies on how many people they killed, using guerrilla as a euphemism for anybody, man, woman, child. One noted that he stabbed 10 people to death and helped burn 150 others. Another soldier sadly wrote, "The innocence I possessed at the time of leaving the homeland has long since disappeared. Now I'm a hardened sinner, and my sword is stained with blood. May God forgive me, may my mother forgive me." Really an interesting passage, I think. How many of these guys do you think came to the Philippines to exact atrocities like this? Like none. And yet they were everyday people who became these killers under these circumstances. That's what's disturbing about it, the sort of harbinger in a way. He and many of thousands of others had grown to hate the Filipinos as race traitors because many Japanese soldiers on the outbreak of the war were very excited because they thought of it as a war of liberation against white colonialism in Asia and the Pacific. Okay, but the problem was their country was just coming as another colonial conqueror, and really more savage in a way than many of the white colonialists had ever been. And so many of these guys, when they come to the Philippines, they think, well, we're going to be welcomed because these guys have been under the American heel for 40 years. We're going to be welcomed as Asian liberators. It wasn't like that. The majority of the population was pretty pro-American. And many of them were guerrillas, fighting against the Japanese, sniping, ambushing, all of this kind of stuff that happens in guerrilla war. And so what happens, the Japanese over time grow to hate them and fear them, and then it grows into this kind of absolute atrocity kind of thing. There was an idealistic lieutenant whose diary I found. And he comes to the archipelago to liberate fellow Asians from white imperialism, as he says it. And instead, of course, he came to hate all Filipinos with a passion, deriding them as, quote, Orientals who will not act like Orientals, wretches who have neither initiative nor national soul. They're a miserable sort of people. They are therefore our enemies, and their presence in Asia must be eliminated to the last man. That's the mindset of a lot of these guys in Manila. So the Americans do what they can to help the survivors, to reclaim them, to get them out of the way. The Americans are saving untold thousands of people this way, but you couldn't save everybody. Very difficult. By the time the fighting petered out in early March, the Americans had suffered over 1,000 killed and 5,600 wounded. They counted 16,655 Japanese bodies. There were probably more, but that's what they found. And about 100,000 Manila residents lost their lives in the Battle of Manila. Again, one of the most important battles in modern military history. It took U.S. Army engineers months to restore the shattered harbor and begin rebuilding the shattered landscape. Take a look at that. That's the aftermath. And it's also now a major humanitarian operation to feed the population and care for them in the urban areas and elsewhere. So the campaign in the Philippines then just sort of wore on through the spring and summer, really kind of to the end of the war. 8th Army then gets the job from MacArthur of clearing out the southern part of the archipelago, south of Luzon. And in 3 months, Eichelberger's 8th Army secures every objective, liberating every major island, notably Cebu, Panay, most of Mindanao, which is the second largest island, an enormous place. The 8th carried out over 35 successful amphibious operations, liberated 7 million Filipinos at the loss of 2,000 American lives, and 7,000 wounded. It was a masterpiece of maneuver and amphibious warfare where Eichelberger is like front and center of this whole thing. But it had little strategic impact, so it's sort of largely forgotten. So it's brilliantly carried out, but questionable in terms of strategic significance. And in the meantime, up on Luzon, day after day, this is your situation if you're one of the American soldiers there. And you'll notice too, if you're looking very closely, you can see a Filipino guerrilla. That's often how the operations are going. You got regular U.S. Army formations, infantry, armor, engineers, and working with Filipino guerrillas, sometimes like as recon or whatever. This kind of terrain too. You know, just imagine trying to operate in that terrain. Day after day, sometimes subsisting on a K ration or 2 per day, out of supply, the heat, the jungles, the caves, the insects, the mud, the rain, the privation, troops struggled with disease and combat fatigue, and fought the usual battles of annihilation against the Japanese. The violence of it all was appalling. The firepower as extensive as anywhere in the war. The Americans blasted and burned the Japanese from hilltop to hilltop, from cave to cave. Give you a quick example. 4 months on the line, one regiment, one typical regiment, the 130th Infantry Regiment of the 33rd Infantry Division, expended nearly 44,000 mortar shells, about 6,400 105 millimeter self-propelled gun rounds, about 30,000 hand grenades, and almost 1.4 million machine gun bullets. Just one regiment in a 4-month period on the line. Regimental staff calculated on average the expenditure of 300 pounds of ordnance for every casualty inflicted on the Japanese. 300 pounds. Think of all the shipping that took and how much coordination you have to have with the Navy and all the logistics of it. And one of the Japanese survivors sadly noted in his diary, "We have underestimated the importance of material power and are suffering the consequences." That was absolutely for sure. It was an infantryman's fight, like you see here. They suffered about 90% of the casualties, and in the course of the campaign, Kruger's 6th Army reported about 38,000 battle casualties, including over 8,000 killed and 157 missing. That was kind of disingenuous. There were 93,400 so-called non-battle casualties that really were battle-related. Immersion foot, malaria, yellow fever, combat fatigue, all those kinds of things were claiming people too that had to be evacuated. So this is just sucking in manpower. It's really on par with what's happening to Eisenhower's armies in the fall of 1944 in Europe, and what the Argonne Forest was in World War I, Grant's Overland Campaign in 1864. Luzon is definitely up here, and yet it's not all that well known, you know. And as I said, the Army does all the ground fighting. So Yamashita's armies, ultimately are defeated, but he doesn't surrender until meaningfully after the formal Japanese government surrender on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri. So in the wake of that formal surrender, and I think this map gives you a sense of this, hundreds of thousands of Japanese servicemen then laid down their arms over the vast expanse of their former empire. And that was an enormous job for Allied military authorities and the Japanese government, especially the U.S. Army. By the end of 1946, some 3.2 million Japanese military personnel and nearly 2.8 million Japanese civilians surrendered and were processed, and in most instances repatriated back to Japan from all these places around the Pacific that you see there, many of which have been bypassed, or whatever else, and in China. So the Monumental War created a number of legacies, and I just want to mention a few. The Army, of course, transforms in the course of World War II from this kind of provincial force into a modern, lavishly supplied, techno-rich, mechanized army, arguably the most powerful ground arm on the planet at that point. Another example, the war was just beginning in Asia. I think it's really important to understand that. VJ Day is the beginning of the fight for many Asians. And so it unleashes what becomes decades of post-colonial war and upheaval and spasms that claims, by one estimate, something on the akin of 10 million lives in Asia. So the war was just beginning there. A third, the Chinese Civil War is, of course, arguably the most important legacy of the war in the Pacific and Asia. And it, of course, the triumph of the People's Republic of China and its existence, I think I have argued that it is the most important event of the Cold War and arguably the most important event of modern history, and I think we're still living with the consequences of it today, might we say. And if we're thinking through different time periods in American history, in a way, of course, that leads to 2 American wars on the Asian continent, Korea and Vietnam, which would not have happened if not for the existence of the People's Republic of China. And of course, also with what happens with the triumph of the communists in China, which leads to a Red Scare in this country that we know as McCarthyism in that era, and as I mentioned, the wars that will be fought, and a kind of eventually an American-led anti-Chinese alliance spanning from the Horn of Africa all the way through the Philippines, what becomes South Korea to Japan, so on and so forth. Quite a legacy, isn't it? A fourth, blood brother alliances with Australia and New Zealand, which have been forged during the war. That is so meaningful from an Australian point of view in particular. About 1 million American servicemen and women either serve in Australia or pass through it in the course of the war. Think of what that means for Australian history and everything ever since. An enormous and important partnership that continues to this day. Fifth, the savagery sets the tone for our combat ever since. Because I think it's fair to say all of our subsequent enemies in World War II don't fight with the rules we would want. They try to kill medics, they treat POWs horribly, and all the kinds of things you see in the war against Japan will continue in Korea, Vietnam, the 21st century wars, whatever it would be. So there's that harbinger too, and it's really the Army's problem on some levels, right? Because the Army is bearing the worst of the brunt of it. So in that sense, the war was more of a beginning than an end. The American victory came at a fearful cost. 111,606 Americans were killed or went missing in the war against Japan. The plurality of these deaths, as I mentioned, were among Army ground soldiers who had a 2.3% death rate. Those whose remains had been recovered were scattered among 133 cemeteries all over the Pacific and Asia. There were 9 in China, there were 55 in Burma and India. Overworked graves registration teams had buried them as carefully and respectfully as possible. As you can imagine, it was a horrible and thankless job. Some stared wide-eyed, a graves registration soldier recalled decades later. Others had died in the middle of a scream and their mouths hung open. Others had no face at all. The work was nightmarish and it ate away at our souls. On May 16, 1946, Congress passed a law called the Return of the World War II Dead Program, and it was an attempt to recover and repatriate as many of the dead as possible. Now, the very existence of this program, I would say, epitomized the country's wealth, its Republican kind of small r commitment to the importance of the individual, that the government had that accountability, must have that accountability to its citizens and to their next of kin to do this. And that this was a kind of a consensus thing. It didn't matter which party you were part of or what your outlook was, you were on board with that in a way. And it also reflected really very commonly held American values about the importance of recovering corporeal remains as a kind of tangible commemorative symbol of the mourned in a burial place that you could visit. So next of kin made the decision whether to return the remains of their loved one or leave them overseas to be buried in an American Battle Monuments Commission cemetery somewhere around the planet. And of course the ABMC had been established after World War I, in which many World War I dead were still buried in France and remain so today. So as next of kin, it was your choice. So you can imagine that debate within a mourning family. You know, some saying we should bring them home, others saying no, they should rest where they are. Who's the decision maker? What's the dynamic there? How long does it take you to decide? All of that. You can imagine the anguished conversations. By 1947, the families had filled out Army Quartermaster Form 345. About 61% chose to have their remains brought home. So you've got then an enormous task on your hands. To give you a sense of this, just as the Army had done so much of the fighting all over the globe, it now takes the lead in carrying out this program. There were about 13,000 soldiers involved in this program, globally. Recovery teams spread far and wide, literally to the ends of the earth, sometimes in very dangerous places, to recover the dead from small graves like this, or in bigger temporary cemeteries like this. The job was exacting and almost ghoulish, as you might imagine. Similar to the way the Americans fought the war, they expended huge amounts of equipment and material. Get this. Crews sprayed a powdery hardening compound into body cavities to minimize stench and fluid leakage. This was a big part of the job. 2 to 5 pounds of compound were expended per body, 2 to 5 pounds. 1 gallon of deodorant spray per 20 bodies. 1 pair of gloves for every 3 to 5 bodies was the standard usage of equipment. By late summer 1947, they had recovered and processed 72,252 remains in the Pacific and Asia area. Now, where were they? There were over 30,000 in Manila, about 3,500 in Calcutta, over 23,000 on Saipan, over 2,000 in Yokohama. Now, that didn't mean they were all killed in those places. It meant they were collected in those places from elsewhere. At last, On September 30th, 1947, the first set of just over 3,000 remains were ready for return aboard this ship, U.S. Army transport Honda Knot. It was a 4,000-ton Liberty ship of the type that had helped win the war by, allowing the Americans to spread the sinews of American bounty overseas. There were going to be 10 other Army funeral ships that will follow in the wake of Honda Knot. The crew of the Honda Knot had meticulously cleaned the ship, lathered it with a fresh coat of paint for these distinguished guests that were now coming aboard. The remains were now ensconced in steel caskets. 10 days later, on October 10th, 1947, Honda Knot, as you see here, majestically glided under the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco Bay. A cannon boomed in the distance. The ship dropped anchor opposite Marina Green, where hundreds gathered for a somber memorial service. The group included the mayor of San Francisco, the Secretary of the Navy, and General Mark Clark. Port crews, after the ceremony, unloaded the now flag-draped caskets, loaded them onto specially fitted rail cars for transportation to their various final destinations. Telegrams were sent to next of kin, informing them of the imminent arrival of the remains. Each casket was escorted by a specially trained serviceman of equal or higher rank than the deceased. The Army had established 15 major distribution centers around the country, and they read like a travelogue of America. San Francisco, Mira Loma, California, San Antonio, Fort Worth, Kansas City, Columbus, Ohio, Philadelphia, New York City, and Charlotte, just to name a few. Before groups large and small, in major cities, mid-sized towns, remote outposts alike, the caskets were ceremoniously buried with full military honors wherever the next of kin chose, at a price of $564.50 per funeral. 78% of the returning dead were buried in a private cemetery or a family plot. The rest in a national military cemetery like Arlington National Cemetery, for instance. In tear-soaked ceremonies, they were buried before groups large and small, some publicly, many just anonymously. Among those now interred in their home soil were many, many thousands of Army soldiers from every corner of the Pacific-Asia War. Private James Henson of the 192nd Tank Battalion, captured in the Philippines, died of beriberi as a POW. Sergeant Frank Simmons, who died of pneumonia in the South Pacific. PFC Norman Petschauer, killed in action with the 27th Infantry Division on Saipan in the summer of 1944. PFC Louis Perfeda, once captain of his high school football team, killed in action at Buna in December 1942. John Zangerly, a sergeant who was killed with the 37th Infantry Division in the ferocious fighting in Manila in 1945. Lieutenant Buford Cooper, killed in a vehicle accident in Burma on the Stilwell Road, the vital land supply link that stretched from India all the way to China to help sustain Chiang Kai-shek's armies that was tying down about half of the Imperial Japanese Army, giving you a sense of the central importance of China in the war. And PFC Monroe Hicks of Sikeston, Missouri, whose hometown paper referred to him as both a returning hero and, quote, a colored soldier. In 1951, after 4 years, in the shipment home of over 171,000 Americans from Europe and the Pacific, and the expenditure of nearly $164 million, the Return of the World War II Dead repatriation program officially ended. But the mourning never really did. Thank you.
To questions. Yes, sir.
Do I understand correctly that after the surrender, the formal surrender of Japan, that then the forces in all these occupied territories surrendered, and there were like 2.4 million civilians, Japanese civilians, as support of the military conquest?
Or as colonists, 2.8 million. So yeah, let's go back, as long as we're talking about it, let's go back to that map. And so you can see in red there, that's the vestiges of the Japanese Empire. And so you had either ethnic Japanese or Japanese colonists or whatever who were then going to be kicked out of wherever they were. A lot of them are in China.
Yeah.
A lot of them are what in today is Indonesia, what at that time was the Dutch East Indies. So they're getting kicked out of there. The Philippines. Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing to think of that 2.8 million were elsewhere. And of course, then all the military personnel too. Over 3 million. That's a lot of people, right? So it's a good thing we didn't have to fight them, I would say. You know, so these 3.2 million, probably, I don't know, half or so, I'm just guesstimating, probably at least half are in China somewhere or somewhere on the Asian continent, probably at least that. And then you can see all these other spots that have been bypassed, you know, as the American armies had sort of island hopped through the Pacific, so a lot of them were bypassed there too. Yeah, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Dr. McManus, do you have with all the studying you've done, do you have any kind of an opinion of what may have happened if we had to invade Japan, if we hadn't dropped the bomb?
Yeah, so that was going to be called Operation Downfall, and there were basically two key phases of it. So the first was to be called Operation Olympic, which meant that you were going to invade Kyushu, which is, of course, the key southern island there. 6th Army was going to get that job, and 6th Army was going to have so many divisions attached to it that it was going to be the largest American field army ever. And even then, it was going to be outnumbered, because intel was showing there were at least 600,000 Japanese soldiers on that island ready to defend it, much less the kamikazes, and let's say only 10% of them get through. That's still going to be a staggering loss to the fleet. So you had that. Operation Cornet was to be the follow-on, which happens in March 1946, to invade near Tokyo on Honshu, the largest island. And that was going to be carried out by Eichelberger's 8th Army, but also with the 1st Army redeployed from Europe, the European theater. And then the 10th Army in reserve. 10th Army had fought the Battle of Okinawa, you know, so it was still kind of licking its wounds. So this would have been the largest invasion in human history by far. And it would have been a terrible catastrophe for both sides. It was also going to be multinational, not the Soviets. They were not going to be involved. They're fighting in Manchuria because they had entered the war on August 9th. But you were going to have Australians, you're going to have British, you're going to have French divisions involved, New Zealanders, and maybe even some Chinese as an expeditionary force too. So I think maybe we'd all agree it was a good thing that that invasion didn't happen.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak to us tonight. A great talk, really appreciate it. It seems like one of the really key factors was with the Philippine liberation was the fact that the Filipinos themselves generally sided with the United States and not Japan. Was that partially because there had been some kind of promise made by the U.S. government that the Philippines would gain their independence, and of course that promise was kept? And it's why the U.S. didn't have to fight like a colonial war after World War II like the French and the Dutch did. So I just wanted to get a sense of how that factored into the Philippines siding with the Americans and not the Japanese.
So there's a number of factors contributing to that. You're right. The Americans had pledged to give the Philippines its independence. So this was the Tidings-McDuffie Act passed in 1934. And so the Philippines had been kind of transitioning to independence in the years before World War II under U.S. auspices. That's what MacArthur was doing in the Philippines, trying to create Filipino armed forces to defend the country. And of course, the war intervenes in the meantime. But yes, there was that promise that was going to be kept, and the Philippines will get its independence in 1946. It's such an interesting duality. Because the Americans, yes, they were colonial occupiers in the Philippines and interlopers on one level, and that's very true. But also, there were some ties of kinship that had solidified over those 4+ decades. And relations were generally decent, I will say. When the Japanese come to the Philippines, they just don't really behave well enough toward the Filipinos to win them over from what was a reasonably pro-American population. And I'm generalizing, of course. There's plenty of anti-American Filipinos, but the Japanese, when they come, they're going to be far too exploitive and brusque and whatever else. And of course, there's plenty of good Japanese soldiers who behave correctly and whatever too. But they're just swimming against that tide. And I think that is, we use the term force multiplier now. The Filipino population being largely on your side, especially Filipino guerrillas and all that, is such a huge component of why that campaign is successful. Just like in Western Europe, when the population of France is on your side after the Normandy invasion, that's a big deal, isn't it? Or Holland, or Belgium, or Luxembourg, or whatever. And of course, the dilemma is too, I should point out, that you're having to sort of destroy what you're liberating. And that's the other thing too that's so tragic, and Manila is the classic example. So from a Filipino point of view, I mean, this is just a seminal moment. Now, I want to just close the loop with one other point, which is also, I think, really kind of forgotten in history. Those guerrilla resistance groups represent different political players, different political components in Filipino life vying for power. And so that's in the offing after World War II once the archipelago gets its independence. And some of them are hardcore communists, the Hooks. And they are basically on the cusp of taking power in Manila in the 1950s. So it was very possible, if not probable, that the Philippines were going to become a communist country. So imagine if that had happened in the context of the Cold War. What a disaster that would have been for the US and would have remained, not to mention for the Filipinos. What happens is a counterinsurgency and carried out by one of the, arguably the most remarkable leader in Philippines history, Ramon Magsaysay, who basically helps destroy that insurgency in the 1950s and solidify the Philippines as a key U.S. ally, albeit one with warts, of course, with corruption and repression and all that kind of stuff too. Nonetheless, non-communist, that'll become very important. Yeah, it's very, a lot of complexity there.
Could you just talk for a little bit about the 11th Corps invasion over the coast at San Antonio and the fighting around Longapo and Zigzag Pass?
Yeah, so let's go back. So that alludes primarily to Bataan. Yeah, so the 11th Corps is another corps that's going to be in play under 6th Army. And their job as the campaign unfolds is to liberate Bataan. You know, the infamous Bataan Peninsula where the Phil-American forces had defended in 1942, where the Bataan Death March happened, so on and so forth. And obviously there's a lot of good defensible terrain there. So this is a bit of a tough nut to crack, especially in the northern part of the peninsula there, what becomes known as the Zigzag Pass. And just by the name of it, you can get a sense of what a great ambush point it would be and all this. So the 38th Infantry Division really does most of the heavy lifting in that particular part of the campaign. They become known as the Avengers of Bataan. And the significance of them liberating Bataan, like towards the end of January and into early February, even as the Manila fight is starting to bubble, is that you can now launch an operation to secure Corregidor, right next door, the famous island where MacArthur had made his headquarters in 1942 and all that. Okay, so there is an airborne and amphibious operation to take Corregidor on the heels of the successful securing of the Bataan Peninsula, primarily by the 38th Division, but not exclusively. So yeah, I mean, that's just the interesting thing about the Luzon campaign. There's all these different elements of it. You could, I am fully confident, you could write multiple volumes on just 6th Army's fight in Luzon, you know, and probably still leave a lot of the battles out. So that's what I mean. It's a kind of difficult, slugging, grinding, anonymous fight in which a lot of people fight just as hard as more famous battlefields like Normandy or the Battle of the Bulge or whatever. It just isn't as well remembered, unfortunately. Yeah. Great point. Yeah. Others?
What was the end result of the conflict/competition between Kruger and Eichelberger? What happened to their careers afterwards?
Yeah, great question. So, by the summer 1945, Eichelberger is just really riding high on the heels of that campaign. It was just, even Kruger had to say, so brilliantly executed. So Eichelberger had become kind of the fair-haired boy at MacArthur's headquarters, and it's probably one of the reasons why 8th Army was going to get the key role, you know, in Operation Cornet and whatnot. Of course, that never happens, and Eichelberger was thrilled that it never happened. Everybody was thrilled. So By the end of the war, though, both of them are going to be involved in the occupation of Japan. So 6th Army and 8th Army are both needed there, at least initially. Ultimately, 6th Army is phased out, and 8th Army will be the main force that's there. And by the way, it's still in Asia today. 8th Army is going to be there when the Korean War happens, and it's the main ground combat component during the Korean War. 8th Army has some pretty famous commanders, Eichelberger, Walton Walker, and another guy named Matthew Ridgway, who leads it in the Korean War, James Van Fleet, Maxwell Taylor. So 8th Army is still there today. Kruger will retire, I think it's either the end of 1945 or the beginning of 1946. He's tired, he's been away from home for a long period of time. He wants to get back with Grace and retire from the Army and build a home in San Antonio. So he had never owned his own home as an adult. So he has a really tragic post-war life. Grace's health really started to decline. She died in the 1950s, and he was devastated. And he made a lot of noise about following her to the grave soon and all this. And he had really difficult hypertension problems, and so he dies in 1967. Really a very unhappy man, unfortunately. He had financial problems. Without getting too deep in the weeds, basically what happened is there was a higher tax bracket if you were like a full colonel or above, and he had allowed his taxes to build up, and so he had a crushing tax bill that put him basically on the edge of financial ruin, and he was dependent upon friends to help him out, and all this. It was humiliating for a retired 4-star general. He had his son got drummed out of the Army for an alcohol-related incident, and then his daughter was married to an Army colonel who was really on the way to becoming a general, and they were stationed in Japan during the Korean War, and she murdered him one night. And yeah, it's just bizarre, but I go into this in the book in some level of detail. And she's a civilian, but she's tried in a military court and convicted. And then eventually that's how they got her freed, because she was a civilian, and yet she'd been subject to the military legal system. So she was released about 5-6 years later and began to rebuild her life, but it was just heartbreak after heartbreak. Eichelberger stays on in the occupation of Japan for about 3 years. And so he's a key player in the occupation of Japan. Then he retires, and he has a much happier post-war life. He and Emma retired to Asheville, North Carolina, which was primarily her hometown. They had a beautiful home. He was financially secure. But the thing about Eichelberger, he thought too much about the past, and if he had one real weakness as a person, it was resentments. He had resentment against Kruger, resentment against MacArthur and all this. He let that build up over time and became bitter on some levels about that. But overall, he had a pretty happy life in retirement. He died in 1961.
Are they still bringing back soldiers that are lost?
Yes.
Even though the program is shut down?
Still bringing back soldiers from the Pacific Theater? Yeah. Yeah, so, and everywhere in World War II. So they are, the program, even though the official program ended in 1951, there, of course, were still many people who were missing in action. Believe it or not, there were 78,000 Americans missing in action in World War II. So many of them, were lost at sea or were killed in air crashes in remote places or whatever. But there has still been an effort by the government, when they could, to either reclaim remains where they are eventually found, sometimes by accident, or when they were buried in a cemetery with no identification, they'd have an idea maybe who's there, and eventually are going to be able to identify. The main way they do it now is through DNA. That you have a family member, you match the DNA. That's a pretty good way to circle back on that. And then if the family wants them relocated to here, they can be. I saw a story just about a week ago about a soldier who was killed somewhere in the Pacific, who was brought home and was buried where his family wanted him buried. Yeah, even all these years later, 80 years later, isn't that amazing? Yeah, good question.
Someplace I read that there were the Japanese lost 320,000 troops in the Philippines. Is that
Overall.
sound reasonable to you?
Probably overall. Yeah, not just on Luzon, of course, because they're,
In the Philippines,
Yeah.
all the islands.
yeah, I mean, probably at least that. Because there were 2 campaigns they fought in the Philippines, and the first one, you know, they probably lost 10 to 30,000, something like that, and the second one, you know, so Yamashita's forces, I think he has about 55,000 left with him, something like that, when he surrenders. Doesn't mean the other 200,000 were all dead, but a lot of them were. And then, of course, you factor in Eichelberger's campaign throughout the rest of the archipelago, how many Japanese were killed. But I will say this, by that time, by the summer 1945, if you were a Japanese soldier with Yamashita or maybe on Mindanao or Cebu or something, statistically, the bigger threat to your life was disease and malnutrition more than American firepower. That's the kind of rotten shape they were in. So their army was just degraded on a lot of levels. But yeah, 320 would not surprise. I don't know for sure, but I would, if anything, that could be an underestimate. Yeah.
So I was curious, have you started a new project you could share with us?
Yeah, I'm actually, you know, I mentioned Ridgway a moment ago, and so yes, I'm doing a full cradle to grave biography of General Matthew Ridgway, who I think, in my opinion, is one of the most important American generals ever. But if we're talking about the 20th century, with the exception of Eisenhower, Marshall, maybe MacArthur, there is no, I will say this definitively, there is no more important American general. He helps found the Airborne, certainly famously leads the 82nd Airborne during World War II, the 18th Airborne Corps. He, if you want to if you'd say which individual, more than any other person on the planet, was responsible for South Korea existing today, it's probably Matthew Ridgway, because of the way he salvages the situation there in 1950 and 51, which was leaning towards disaster. Then he takes over for MacArthur when he's famously fired by Truman, so he leads the whole Far East. Then he takes over for none other than Eisenhower, after Eisenhower is the military commander of NATO, initially in 1952, and then runs for president. Does that, and then, oh, by the way, becomes Army Chief of Staff and keeps the U.S. out of Vietnam in the 1950s, and then has this retirement that goes on for decades in which he's really kind of an influential kind of elder statesman on some level. So I really think that he's important and fascinating, and so that's my next thing. I wanted to get away a little bit from hardcore combat history and become a little more interested in senior level leadership.
Yeah. Which one of those divisions carried out the raid at Cabanatuan, or they probably murdered at the prison camp? Was that one from the north, from Kruger?
It's coming from it's coming from the north. So it's actually not a division. It's the 6th Ranger Infantry Battalion, in addition to Filipino guerrilla forces. So where is that happening? Oh, sort of about right there, I'd say. And so in case you haven't heard of it, this was a POW camp called Cabanatuan, where you had, 400 to 500 U.S. prisoners still there. And the 6th Ranger Infantry Battalion is going to have a raid behind the Japanese lines to go and liberate and recover these guys and get them back to safety. It's an amazing story. It's a beautifully carried out operation. And as I said, it's the Filipino guerrillas who do a lot of the heavy lifting, and in fact, the majority of the dying. I think there's 1 or 2 Rangers who were killed in action, but the Filipinos lose a couple of dozen, at least several dozen. And they successfully get these guys out. The subplotter or context to this, most of the American POWs by that time, by the early months of 1945, had been moved out of the Philippines by the Japanese months earlier with the approach of U.S. armies. They'd been moved elsewhere in the Japanese Empire, most notably to Japan, to work as slave labor in mines and factories and the like. And of course, many had tragically been killed when they were being shipped there because the ships were not marked as POW ships, and they're tragically sunk by U.S. submarines, U.S. air. These are called hell ships. The conditions aboard those ships neither the English language nor any other language I know of could adequately describe and convey how horrible the conditions were for those POWs. So the guys who remained in the Philippines were those the Japanese thought of as in the worst condition who could not be moved. So that gives you a little sense of what a challenging thing this was. So the 6th Ranger Infantry Battalion carries that out beautifully. And that's really kind of their shining moment of the war. I should also mention there were other liberations too. There were Allied internees, primarily American, at the University of Santo Tomas in the heart of Manila. They are liberated by the 1st Cavalry Division, and there are other Allied POWs, American POWs at Bilibid Prison, an old Spanish-era prison, who were liberated by the 37th Infantry Division, and then the capstone of the whole thing, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, which weirdly is not part of the 11th Airborne Division, carries out a coup de main to liberate a place called Los Baños that had about 2,000-3,000 Allied civilian internees too. So these operations have happy endings.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your research. I have a quick question in back.
Hi. Sorry.
Were there war crime trials here similar to Nuremberg?
There were, but they were much more so than European theater. They were selective. Some of the worst Japanese perpetrators were never punished. And most notably, those who served as part of the infamous Unit 731 in China that carried out biological warfare, chemical warfare, medical experiments on people, including some American POWs. And the reason behind that is the Cold War, where China becomes now the main enemy and Japan now a nascent ally and all this. Well, more to the point maybe of our discussion tonight, the atrocities in Manila. Does anyone pay for that? It's Yamashita. MacArthur will ultimately blame him for what happened, even though the Japanese general never ordered these atrocities, would have tried to prevent them, did not want them carried out or whatever. He is blamed, and this creates a kind of troubling legal precedent of a commander being responsible for what his or her people do, even if it's directly contrary to what their wishes are. So he is hanged in early 1946. His chief of staff was too, but more for atrocities in China than this. So the problem is somebody had to pay. Okay, I mean, I think we'd all agree. Somebody had to pay the price for what the Japanese did in Manila. But it's Iwabuchi who's the main perpetrator, and he's dead. He dies, during the last of the fighting. So what were you going to do? Yeah, I mean, I'm no legal scholar, but it's a kind of a troubling thing. In terms of other lower level atrocities like POW camps and whatnot, yes, guards were convicted, officers are convicted, you have some people who were involved with the rape in Nanking in China who were convicted. But the pattern you tend to see is people who were kind of connected to the emperor or politically on the sort of right part of the scale in terms of who's accepted and who's not. They tended maybe to not be punished, and others who were on the outs were. One of the things I saw in the course of this research was in the early 1950s pardons for some of the Japanese war criminals, most of whom were like camp guards who either tortured Allied POWs or beat them up or in some cases murdered them, who are now going to have sentences commuted as a transition to Japanese sovereignty with the end of the U.S. occupation. And you see the signature on the pardons by none other than the new President Dwight Eisenhower in 1953. This was the price of having an alliance with Japan and the end of the occupation and all that. Kind of similar in some ways to the European theater, where some Nazis or former Nazis or friendly to Nazis folks don't necessarily face justice either, maybe for some of the same reasons. Werner von Braun would be the best example, who becomes crucial to the space program, but really did have a hand in some level of German slave labor in the Holocaust, in the building of rockets and all that. So yeah, it's a tough topic, absolutely.
Dr. McManus, we always find you enjoyable and educational to talk, and when we leave here, I'm aware of one podcast at least, we have ways of making you talk, where you're on there on occasion. Are there other podcasts? Where else can we listen to you once we're gone from here
Right, as if you'd want more, but I appreciate it. Yeah, so I host 2 podcasts actually, and the one you had mentioned is We Have Ways of Making You Talk in the USA that I co-host in tandem with my friend James Holland, who's an incredible historian, and Al Murray, who is another friend of mine who's an incredible comedian in Britain. But having said that, I mean, he's a first-rate World War II historian too, with a degree in history from Oxford, and so he comes to the topic very, very honestly. So we generally focus on U.S. World War II type of topics there, and just sort of shoot the breeze, like as if we're hanging out in a pub kind of thing. The other podcast that I host is called Someone Talked, and I host that in tandem with 2 people from the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia, which if you haven't been there, I'd highly recommend that to you. It's a beautiful place. And the format of that one is we generally have other World War II authors on who have a new book or something, and we question them about their book. It's fascinating conversations. So we just recorded one with Kate Landeck, for instance, who is, in my opinion, the leading authority on the women's Air Force service pilots in World War II, has written a book I highly recommend called The Women with Silver Wings. And so that's one of many of these episodes that we'll have in the can. And so anywhere you look for podcasts or whatever, you can find either of those. We Have Ways USA or Someone Talked. Appreciate the interest. Thanks. Chuck?
I'm going to ask you a question that I've had in my mind since I got out of the Navy in World War II. And there's the last landing that we made before they signed the peace treaty on the ship was a place called Wakanoro 1, Japan. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of that? Mm-hmm. Oh. Well,
I don't know a lot about it, but I have heard of it, yeah.
You're the first one that I ever knew that actually heard it. We unloaded the troops there, but they weren't in combat. They were just staying on the beach. They didn't unload that many. I don't know why they were unloading them, because at that point they were signing the peace treaty on the ship. Now, what I'm trying to find out is, I have asked many, many people who have been in World War II and had something. Nobody knows about Wakanor 1, and nobody knows that we unloaded troops, we unloaded supplies, we unloaded everything. Like if it didn't go right on the ship, we were all prepared to continue the beachhead and go. But we already had our boats. In fact, my boat was on the beach, and we were going back and forth to the ships in the bay to bring supplies and troops in. And never ever hear anything about not walking or one.
I know, you don't hear it. So if I venture to answer, yours was part of the sort of amphibious beginning of the occupation. So the aerial side was the famous landing at Atsugi with the 11th Airborne Division and all that MacArthur and Eichelberger are part of. Yours was the amphibious side, I think maybe with the 1st Cavalry Division, but I could be wrong about that.
I'm not sure, but we were definitely the first American troops to put feet on Japanese soil. And I myself made about 5 trips back and forth from the ship to the beach with troops, with supplies and so forth. But I never ever heard anything more about it after we left there.
Yeah, it really gets overshadowed by the airfield landings and of course by the USS Missouri.
Okay. I'm
surrender.
glad you knew about it.
I did. I'm no expert, but I did know about it, and I would say in the larger context, yours was the first part of like the amphibious landings that were part of the occupation. Yeah, great stuff, Chuck.
Well, that cleared up a lot.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you coming.
Pleasure.
We're going to keep bringing as much as we can. I have a guest here. He's also one of our members, and it's just a little bit further out, but it's called Gulf Leyte. He was in the Gulf of Leyte. He served on the command ship.
USS
Let me read your hat. USS Wasatch. AGC 9, So they're all mountain ranges, is that it? And this is in Utah. I like to say, to our friend here, he's been with us for a long time. He's a veteran. He served on the Wasatch. He was a boat driver. He took the boats into the beaches.
Absolutely. Yep.
Sat on the beaches, couldn't leave. And shells were coming in. And then he also, I think you took MacArthur in for the landing, didn't you? No combat, but he waited ashore twice until they got that film just right. But I want to thank our veteran here tonight
Absolutely.
for his service.
And all our veterans, absolutely.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah, I think that'll do it.
Okay.
Unless anybody else has another question. Thank you so much, John.
Sure thing.
Greatly appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to Chris Huffman, our president of the Roundtable. He has a brief presentation to make and also tell us a little bit about next month's program.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks for helping with the introductions tonight and the announcements. Our Vice President Jeff is traveling right now, so Bill kindly helped to do that. And I have a few remarks at the end here, but before that I want to give our gifts to the speaker. That we have our famous coffee mugs that we give, and actually we're selling some out front, so, but of course you'll get a free one, of course.
Awesome.
And I also enjoyed, we were at dinner with the speaker and President Charlie and our new treasurer Bill and an associate. So we enjoyed talking and had a great conversation before that. So here's another mug for your collection, John.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
I really appreciate
Fun.
it. John has really been a trooper for us. He's come to so many of our presentations for us that he's done, and he's always been happy to say yes, and he's a star speaker across the world, and to have him here when, you know, the U.S. military, other very famous people want to have him is a great achievement for us, I think, and a great thing to present for you guys. And so thanks, John, for your great presentation once again, and congratulations on your brand new book and the conclusion of your trilogy.
Thanks.
John said tonight at dinner that it took about 10 years to do all this research. It's an awful lot of research and an awful lot of work, and now he's had the payoff and the achievement. Okay, guys, so I do want to announce the next month's speaker, like Bill had mentioned. I mentioned at dinner with John and Charlie and others, and Bill and others, that it'll be Jack Myers, who is a World War II tank destroyer battalion guy, European theater. He served, and just want to make sure I have all my remarks I want to say here. He served at both an M36 tank destroyer and also anti-tank unit. And so he's already said yes to speaking graciously, and he'll be here July 6th. We're still working on August and September, so stay tuned, we'll get back to you. I want to thank our presidents who are here tonight. Bill Jackson's been here a lot of times, our founder and first president, but I don't see him tonight. Maybe he's on vacation. I know a lot of people are on vacation, hitting the summer now, just about. So, and we have a few board members on vacation right now. We're traveling, and some to go. But I also want to thank our former president Charlie and Kirk Gibson, who attended tonight. Thanks so much for being here. You both set an example, and I joined the board when Kirk was president, and then shortly thereafter, Charlie took over as our intrepid president for 4 years or so, and as our president. Charlie had many strong years of faithful service before that as vice president and speaker coordinator. And I just want you to know that, you know, Charlie took me under his wing when I joined as a guy walking off the street as a volunteer. I was just a guy coming to the meetings like, many of you are here. And I said, hey, I like the dynamic with this group. I want to get involved. And Charlie was so gracious, invited me into the fold and just took me under his wing, you know. And I don't want to get emotional, but Charlie is just a great guy. And, well, I mean, so is Kirk and the other board members. But, you know, Charlie, we went across the state to interview so many veterans and World War II guys, and like Chuck, and we interviewed Chuck, for example, Chuck right here. We were at his home, and it was so wonderful. But anyway, Charlie, thanks so much for being here, and I hope you'll continue to come meeting after meeting, and Kirk too, and Bill, I think will be here next time. So thanks guys for coming. I want to thank Bob Watkins. He's here tonight. Thanks for coming, Bob. I want to thank you for your years of faithful service as our treasurer. You did a great job. We always are making money with you, you know, and having great things, our achievements, and you kept everything in the books in good order. And we're doing great. So thanks, Bob, for your years of hard work, and I appreciate that. Thanks for coming, and I hope you'll continue to come to our meetings as well. And thanks to our board members who always are doing things every month, and those off the board, on the board, our other volunteers too, helmet committee guys in the back, other volunteers we need to thank. And thanks to you, our audience, for being here as well, because you make it work, and your donations help us keep going. We do sometimes have expenses with hotel bills for speakers. I mean, not tonight, obviously, but sometimes we do, and sometimes we have other transportation, other costs that we had. We had our Zoom cost, we have other costs. So if you want to donate for us, it's not required, but we would appreciate that. And so thanks, guys, for being here. I don't want to take too long of your time, but thanks. Have a good night. We'll see you next month in July. Jack Myers, World War II vet. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to all the veterans in World War II, guys. Thank you.
Thanks. I guess I'll just head up there. I guess I'll just head up there to sign.
Yeah.